Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's pretty late on Sunday evening, and to be honest, there's so much for me to talk about that this video could seriously overrun. There's been some bombshell, and I do mean bombshell revelations over the weekend. I'm going to try to cover everything that's happened since Friday, keep you in the loop whilst keeping this video to a decent size. But before we get on to the actual main video, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Do you know, only 30% of my audience has actually subscribed to the channel. So subscribe, help me grow those numbers. So let's start off with the first news story. And this is actually the news story around the GNU fractures, specifically around the national dialogue. Now, for those of you who don't recall, obviously the DA said it was going to withdraw from the national dialogue following its 48 hours ultimatum to Cyril Ramaphosa, which John Steenhuisen gave to remove the corruption accused. Now, following the withdrawal of the DA has also said that it would be voting against ANC ministers who are implicating corruption and any budgets that they put forward in their departments. Now, this has prompted Thabo Mbeki, former President Thabo Mbeki, to write an open letter to John Steenhuisen calling the DA's stance arrogant and anti-democratic. He also said he found it rather odd that John Steenhuisen hadn't just withdrawn from the GNU and taken the opposition benches. He says if somebody had this much of a beef with Cyril Ramaphosa, then surely they'd just leave. In any case, Thabo Mbeki says that John Steenhuisen, if he continues to boycott ministerial duties, such as going to the national dialogue, that this would count as insubordination and could lead to his dismissal. Now, you see, the DA is in this awkward spot. It's in government, but it's acting like an opposition. It's what you might call oppositional theatrics, even though it's actually in government. And this has prompted Musi Maimane, the former head of the DA, to caution the DA against this, what they classed as a high-risk gamble, which could destabilize reform efforts, they said. Though I have to ask the logical question, and that is, at this point in time, many of us asking the question of what reform efforts, because many of us aren't actually seeing any of these so-called reforms. Now, one of the parties that are noticeably absent in this is actually Action SA, because you may recall that Action SA actually sided with the ANC in Johannesburg. And now that coalition, yes, they say they weren't in coalition, they were just supporting each other on an issue-by-issue basis. Well, that coalition, because it was a coalition, has now come to an end with Action SA being voted out as Speaker, and they say they are no longer going to work with the ANC. But they seem to forget that they said they were not going to be working with the ANC under any circumstances, and then they went into coalition with them anyway. So, let's wait to see what happens. In any case, going back to that whole scathing letter from Thabo Mbeki, he said that the DA, specifically Helen Zille, was arrogant. And he argued that ultimately what the DA really should do is just quit government. Now, you see, John Steenhuisen did hit back at this and did say that actually the biggest problem with the national dialogue is it was just an ANC-run talk shop, which would be aimed at diverting away from the ANC's failures, such as, VBS looters and state capturers and what, and that ultimately it would just become an election ploy. And this is actually true. This on the back today that apparently the ANC has acquitted 4 of its potentially corruption-accused state capturers of, corruption. So the ANC has judged itself and has found itself not guilty. This is what we're faced with. Now, I am reminded that we did actually have a national dialogue, a talking shop once before. It was called the Zondo Commission. And for those of you who don't recall, that was over nearly R1 billion as well. And there's been no prosecutions from it. So anyway, what's to say that this is going to be any different? As far as I'm concerned, and as far as anybody with logical brain cell, the entire idea behind the national dialogue is just a fraud. It's an idea that was actually originally put forward by Jacob Zuma. So the legacy of Cyril Ramaphosa is going to be the delivery of Zonda and doing nothing, and then doing a national dialogue and doing nothing. So it would seem on the face of it that Cyril Ramaphosa's legacy is, well, nothing. In any case, you may be asking yourself a question, and that is, currently, where is Cyril Ramaphosa? Well, actually, he's at a BRICS conference. And at this BRICS conference, the BRICS parties all wrote a statement. So they've drafted a statement which condemns unilateral trade sanctions by Donald Trump. They also criticized Israel's Gaza war effort. They supported the Paris Climate Agreement. They called for AI regulation. And they expanded their members to now 11 full members, with 10 more wishing to join as observers. Now, South Africa aligns with all these emerging powers for a multipolar world. And to be frank, it's just South Africa's way of trying to be relevant. It's a very small country with a very small GDP, very small population. And so actually, even if you look inside BRICS itself, South Africa is a nobody. And the idea of a multipolar world is to take countries that are nobodies, usually due to policy failure, and try to give them some kind of a voice, saying that countries that are actually successful with big GDPs, big population size, like the US, for example, that they should shut up and not have as much of an impact on the world stage, even though they account for the world's largest economy. But in any case, that's apparently how this whole thing works. And apparently, by drafting the statement, all while South Africa is attempting to negotiate brand new trade agreements with Donald Trump, is apparently a good idea. Said no one ever. Now, while Cyril Ramaphosa has been away, he also did manage to write some tweets about the death of Deputy President David Mabuza, who died, as you will know, if you see my YouTube short on this, he died at age 64. Now, Ramaphosa has declared a national mourning, which basically means the flags fly at half-mast. And apparently he's going to get a Category 2 state funeral. According to Cyril Ramaphosa, the whole nation is in mourning. Nobody, the ANC, is in mourning. The rest of the nation don't care, because they generally tend to class the ANC itself as a bunch of looters. Now, talking of looters, let's actually get onto one of those really bombshell stories. And this is the accusation made by the KZN police commissioner that apparently the police minister has been accused of links to a crime boss, and that apparently he allegedly shut down an anti-hit squad team to protect that syndicate. He's also been accused of receiving financial favors from underworld figures. Now, whether or not he's actually been implicated in this, whether or not it's actually true, remains obviously to be seen. But the police commissioner in KZN did say this in public, on camera, at a press conference, which is very, very damning. Now, in normal fashion, the political parties are now demanding the police minister's suspension, and comparisons are being drawn to previous events where this has happened before. Now, obviously, the police minister denies all accusations, and he says, well, it's completely baseless. But he agrees to an independent probe. Now, the ANC at this point in time hasn't actually done anything about it in typical fashion, because obviously it's the prerogative of the president who he wants to appoint. But Cyril Ramaphosa, being good president that he is, did say that he would be giving this his full attention when he gets back from Brazil, maybe. In any case, what does that actually mean? Well, in my personal opinion, what it actually means is that in typical fashion, the ANC will protect its own, they'll protect their minister, and the police commissioner will probably get a hiding of some variety or go missing or something like that. And let's be honest, there's just going to be no accountability yet again for an ANC ministers. I'm reminded again that the ANC cleared 4 of its NEC members linked to state capture. So that yet again, this is how the ANC work. I mean, these guys are literally organized crime at this point. So who's surprised on any of this? Now, the next story, and it's a really important one to come out with, is actually the story of Bidvest. And this is that Bidvest is running a bursary scheme for children of low-income employees. And this is literally aimed at grades 4 to 12 within their organization, and ultimately covers school fees, uniform, stationery, tutoring, and you see, everybody is applicable. And you see, everybody can apply for it unless you're white, because it expressly excludes white children who are excluded, because the only people who are eligible for this are Black, Indian, and colored children. Now, in typical fashion, you have to ask the question, why white children have been excluded? And in typical fashion, they say, well, it's redress. But I'm reminded that the redress in the company, given the size of the company, already has BEE targets in order to shape management structures in a certain way. And that people within the company have been using BEE targets for some time. So you may argue that the company has already been redressed. But in typical fashion, this isn't redress. It's racism, and it's racism against white individuals. And so, unsurprisingly, Solidarity, along with other unions, have now approached Bidvest demanding some clarity and the reversal of what they class as the no whites policy. Because it is a no whites policy. Why is Bidvest doing this? We have all sorts of employment equity legislation, BEE frameworks, corporate redress structures, and yet again, there is another policy in place, again, which expressly excludes whites entirely, especially in sectors like education. And you have to ask yourself the question of why? Now, going back to the national dialogue, we are reminded that the cost of the national dialogue is going to be like 1 billion. Well, actually, it's going to be 700 million, but the likelihood is it's going to have increased. And it always has increased. So one has to look and say, okay, we're doing all these things such as, I don't know, national dialogues to do complete garbage. Solidarity built a full university for 200 million. You could build 4 universities like Solidarity did for the cost of the national dialogue, and you'd actually get something positive out of it. You'd actually get a place for education, because education uplifts individuals. So why are we wasting money? Why are we still being racist against white people under the guise of redress when redress could easily be done by, I don't know, don't waste the money, for example? Now, coming on to the very final news article, and this is that the Chief Justice is championing language equality. And this is the Chief Justice saying that she opposes English-only court directives. She advocates for multilingual court proceedings to ensure that there's equitable access to justice. She says that language barriers have forms of disadvantages to millions of South Africans in the legal processes, and that actually, if you think about it, because they can't communicate in that language, it would be better for a decolonization movement if we stripped English from these public institutions, or at least made English only not the only option. But you see, here's the problem, right? Anybody who understands any form of linguistics, and this is the question of, when you use certain words, they have different meanings when translated into different languages. And remember that the whole point of the court and law is to give a form of uniformity. Judgments are meant to be repeatable. So if you apply a certain principle, the principle must be clear and it must be repeatable and reapplicable in future cases. But we've seen instances. Let's use the example of this famous shut up scenario, which we were told was not rude, because in isiXhosa, we were told that the way that it's phrased is not rude in that language, but you see, it is in English. You see, and this is an example of something very small, when used across the different language barriers, is going to introduce all forms of legal uncertainty into the legal system. That's not what you're meant to do. That's the reason most legal systems only focus on one language. You don't have a legal system that has numerous languages, because it doesn't work. It introduces linguistical problems. I would have thought that somebody with the IQ of a Chief Justice knew this, but apparently they don't, because the idea of just doing this decolonization, it's always decolonization. It's always decolonization. In Rome, they still use Latin. They use Latin for hundreds of years after nobody spoke it. You know why? Because it was a uniform language. And it meant that it avoided uncertainty when it came through to forms of linguistics interpretation. This should be obvious to bloody anybody. But anyway, South Africa. So as a recap, ladies and gentlemen, so much to talk about today. There's obviously the whole national dialogue that's just going freaking nowhere. And let's be honest, the corruption allegations against the police minister is shocking. Bidvest's approach to their white staff, terrible. And yet again, more decolonization movements. All my views, my opinions, let me know what you think in the comment section. Until tomorrow, I tried to make this video at least condensed. This video could have easily been 2 hours. There's just so much to talk about. In any case, until tomorrow, bye.